Hey guys, Veronica here. So today I want to talk a little bit more about cover crops. I know it's my favorite subject, but I think that cover crops are just such a fascinating way to both infuse life into your soil as well as create a living mulch in your garden. So without further ado, I get a lot of questions about how I terminate cover crops, how I work them into my rotation, and I just wanted to kind of cover my method to my madness there because it sort of goes against the school of thinking with traditional cover cropping to some extent. A lot of this has come out of observation, and a lot of it is kind of fussing with it and playing with it. If you're very much like a plant and be done person, one, gardening's probably not for you, but also two, the methodologies that I explore here may not be up your alley. But if you're looking for something that is not actually all that fussy and usually pretty workable and will give you a lot more plants, then stick around because we're going to cover sort of what I've discovered over the years as I've begun cover cropping and just working with, like these big, massive, messy plantings that I really am attracted to. So yeah, one of the things I get asked a lot is how I go about terminating cover crops. How do I make the transition between my cover crops to my normal crops? And I guess the long and short of it is that I really don't. As you can see, there's still cover crops in basically every row of my garden. And this is something I've been playing with now for a couple of years, not so much in the framework of cover crops, so much as companion planting with succession planting. But I found that cover crops are a really great way to achieve this because, one, when you're planting cover crops, especially if you're using a really diverse mix of cover crops, you're usually using a lot of plants that will be really decent companion plants for the following crops, which are your main ones, right? So right now, moving out of these winter cover crops and into summer crops, there's a lot of things like mustard, radishes, things in that brassica family that will offer some protection, some insect resistance and repellent even to some extent for a lot of your things in your cucumber family, like your squashes and pumpkins and melons and things that, are susceptible to vine borers. Well, they don't really love radishes. Now, a lot of gardening texts will tell you, plant a few icicle radish seeds. Sometimes they're specific around your mound that you're planting your squash or pumpkins or cucumbers or melons in. And some of them will say, plant just radish seeds. And the thing that I've discovered is that if the radish is not fully germinated and up and moving and pumping out those big stinky brassica scents to the insect population around, they're not going to do much in terms of deterring anyone because it's just not in existence. And so one of the ways I found to sort of mitigate that is by already having these big stinky radish leaves completely surrounding the mounds when I push the seeds in. They're there from day one. So there's stuff like that. Let's keep going through it. If you are looking to terminate, so if you're looking to either till in or dig in, depending on your soil circumstances, or if you're looking to chop and drop, the one thing that I will advise in this space, and I saw one here. So what we're looking for is, and you can see on this guy, he's just past that stage now. But what we're looking for is, when it comes to your leguminous plants, your beans and peas like favas, Austrian winter peas, this is I want to say a garbanzo or a lentil, all of the things in the beans and peas space, is we're looking for them sort of in the pre-flower phase or just starting to flower. That's when the nitrogen is going to be at the highest. That was something that I learned from my friends at Leaky Gardens, and that's something that I've kind of taken to heart in terms of when do we harvest, because they're looking at it from that high protein, high nitrogen equals high protein perspective. And so that makes sense for our gardens too, right? Let's make sure we're locking as much nitrogen into the soil as possible for our next round of crops. So with the beans, peas, that sort of stuff, you can see this guy is now putting on flowers. And if we let him keep going, that'll produce seed. That does take a lot of the nitrogen that it's starting to bank in the soil right back out so that it can produce the next round of seeds. But we have a choice there, right? Do we cut it? Do we till it in? I don't till it in. I just cut it and let the roots decompose in place and let this become mulch. I think that that's the most natural approach. Or do you let it go to seed and then, collect seeds for the next season? So when you're working in a space that is this small, and I'm talking under 2,000 square feet. I think I'm maybe cultivating like 800 square feet right now, if that. You can really start to, spend a little more time, the time you typically spend weeding, instead going through and pruning out and addressing cover crops so that you get the most bang for your buck, really. So what I'm going to show you right in this row before we keep on moving. One, this is for this chickpea. Again, it's flowering. It's in that flowering phase. Still going to be pretty peak nitrogen, but once you start seeing those flower buds, like these little bitty, can you see that? Yeah, I think you maybe can. These little bitty flower buds, they start popping. Once you see that, it's time to chop and drop, and we're going to bank that nitrogen back in the soil. Usually with the vetch, it's kind of the same. I'll start to see just little buds kind of start to poke out of these side shoots in between each leaf and stem node. And once you see those little buds come out, that tends to be my indicator that the vetch is almost ready to go. With the, there's one on this row, I think. With the favas, I'll just pop a top off here. I notice with the favas, and this guy's starting to attract some aphids actually. So again, as you're going through looking at all of these things, if you see something functioning as a trap crop, by all means, like pull that and get it out of the space, unless you also see it with lots of beneficials. I've noticed, with the plants that have aphids, that there's a lot of beneficial babies showing up in terms of ladybug larvae, lacewing larvae. Like, I'm not gonna mess with their food source. They eat a lot of aphids per day. I'm gonna see if nature can't balance itself. If it gets overwhelming, then we'll start pulling those crops. But if you don't have beneficials in place and you start seeing a lot of pest insects, by all means, like pull those trap crops out. But anyway, with the favas, I'm looking for these little black spots that start to form towards the top as it gets to a point where it's going to start blooming. That's sort of the indicator I use. And so each plant will have an indicator. With brassicas, like you can see some here behind me, they start to shoot up a main stem. They start to bolt. You'll see it make a little, we'll just pull one off here. It'll make a little flower bud that looks like a little broccoli floret. And that's a sign that that's getting ready to go to seed as well. And again, producing seed takes a lot of nutrients out of the ground and puts them into seed format so that it can carry on. So making the decisions about exactly what you're looking for, what the goal is, and keeping that in mind, from one section of your garden to the next, to kind of create just like the most complicated, simplest plan of attack. So that being said, what I'm doing in this space now, so what I do with my cover crops is I just go through and I prune stuff as I see fit. I don't come through and chop and drop everything at once. When I'm doing these really intensive plantings, if you are going to like plant something in, you could go through and chop and drop everything. But what I've noticed is wildlife doesn't touch my plants as much if there's like just this wild diversity of plants they don't want to eat. I'm talking mainly the brassicas, but there's also onions in here on the back sides of rows, planted separately. And in this space in particular, I've noticed there's a little slug pressure on the onions. And so what I'll do basically is I'll just come through on the back side, kind of indiscriminately, but also with some thought. And some of these greens, like a lot of times what I'll do if I'm doing lots of rows is I'll separate what we can eat and wash it and cook it versus, we don't really eat like a lot of the bean leaves, but a lot of the brassica leaves can be cooked and eaten. So if you want to get, a little more food out of it. But I just come through otherwise fairly indiscriminately. If I'm trying to give plants like these onions some space, again, I notice some slug pressure on them, and so I don't want that. And then I'll just cut out all of the leaves that are leading up to or getting very close to these onions right here, so that the onions have just a little more room to breathe. They can get a little more sun, and they don't have slugs crawling up on them quite so easily from these other plants, because a lot of times the slugs will hang out, in this center section that's nice and cool and wet all day, and then at night they'll come over to the onions. And I wasn't expecting to see slug pressure on the onions, but the slugs are tasting everything, so it's okay. So that's basically what I'll do in here. I'll leave maybe a couple inches of stubs. I don't always cut all the way to the ground Like, I'm not always trying to get rid of the entire plant. I still want to keep those roots in there as long as possible and growing as long as possible because they are banking water. And I don't really want to cut too far in, because one of the things that's really cool about cover crops, and you'll notice, and I'll get some, let's see, I'll get a little bit of soil from under this pathway. It shouldn't be too bad because it's getting mulched well. But so it's actually not bad at all. So that's my pathway soil, right? And then I'll get a little bit of soil from inside of where these cover crops are. And so that's the cover crop soil. And they actually look pretty similar because they're still pretty close to each other. But one thing I'll notice about the cover crop soil, like real fast, is that it's just, I'd say at least 3 to 4 times more moist than the pathway soil. And that's because there are roots in that soil. So I think the common school of thought is that that more roots in the soil equals more competition, but really it's about the nature of competition, and at a certain point it doesn't need to be competitive. It's more collaborative than competitive, really. So we're looking for collaboration, not competition, among our plants so that they can help support each other and support our main crops, essentially. Like, that's really the goal here, right? Is to kind of keep it cleaned up enough around these main crops so that they can get, you know, a really healthy jump start on the season, that we don't have to water them way too much, that they have the right sort of microbial activity around their root zones from everyone else nearby. Now, if you do not have slug issues, you could take all of these greens and just keep mulching your beds with them. I'm probably going to mulch anything we're not eating. I'm going to mulch the pathways with it, just because I don't want to create a really great hiding spot for the slugs on top of my onions or on top of, you know, whatever I'm still trying to get going. Now, I'm going to tilt you guys in this direction. Let me undo this. There we go. Because you'll also see there are things, it's a little bright, so I'll get a close up. There are things like these brassicas that I do let go to seed. I let go to flower and to seed because I don't have any other flowers right now. So if I want pollinators in my garden, if I want beneficial insects to show up, you gotta have some flowers. And I will take whatever flowers I can get, which means if I have radishes or turnips or, mostly radishes and turnips, a few mustards that are starting to bolt and go to seed because the heat just kicks up here so quickly, then I'm gonna let them go, and I'm gonna let that whole process go. Even though I know I'm losing nutrients from the soil to produce those seeds, I'm also gaining the attractant for beneficial insects, for pollinators, for all of my integrated pest management, really. So it really is about balancing and weighing the pros and cons of, if I make this decision, what happens, versus if I make this decision, what happens. There's no black and white in this area, really. It's about finding that sort of synergistic element to managing it effectively, and it will require some, playing and trial and error and a little bit of failure here and there. But for the most part, I've found it to be really successful. Again, like, I have tons of cover crops that are just Swiss cheese to death by slugs, but I don't really mind it, because as long as they're putting pressure on my cover crops and not on my main crops, then it's not a huge issue. So let's move over to another part of the garden and kind of explore a little bit more about what I'm talking about here. Hopefully some of this is making sense, but we'll just keep talking about it and keep open the dialogue and conversation here, because I do think it's a really powerful tool to use in the home garden, no matter what size you're growing in. Okay, so I had to stop at the tomatoes before I got to the other part of the garden, just to show you guys. So these are the ones I planted, I think, 2 weeks ago, and not the ones I did last week. They didn't, rebound quite that quickly, but these were chopped back almost as much and have rebounded this much. So it goes to show the power of a strong root system. But I wanted to show you, again, with the cover crops in this space, what I did was really move as many away from the tomatoes as I could. But at a certain point, I kind of start cutting into here. So right in this section next to the tomatoes, or in between them, I have little bits of seedling basil that I put in. And those guys, I just come in and I cut all of these cover crops back, just the leaves that are hanging over them now. Now that they're big enough to support themselves, kind of much longer roots, you can tell when a plant has developed some depth of roots, because it really starts growing above ground. Until that point, I sort of let the cover crops ride and protect them and give them enough moisture and shade to really get going. And then once they get going, I'm pulling some of these leaves back. They don't need quite as much shade. And so now they can get adequate sun and still share in the moisture really from underneath. So it's a really kind of brilliantly simple way to go about managing seedlings without having to really like coddle them along. Okay, we're gonna move to the rest of the rows now. I wanted to show you guys that. And so now we're in the other section that I was talking about. And this is the area that I've been planting corn and squash and some beans. And also, as you can see, it is full of cover crops as well, because that is really, when I get into a new space, that is my primer for the soil. It does not matter where the soil is at. If I get roots in the soil, if it is bare or if it is weedy or if it's compacted, and I can loosen it up and break it up a little, get some plants in the soil, get some roots in the form of cover crop seeds, cover them with some mulch as we did, right when we got here, then the odds of success go through the roof no matter what's going on, because now you have this really diverse plant community to kind of piggyback off of with your main crops. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have to add, compost or other amendments as we move through the season, because again, a lot of our summer things are really heavy feeders, but it does set you up for success in terms of not having to water quite as much, maybe not having to use as much amendments, and then also having sort of the support to trick various things throughout your ecosystem or your immediate, ecological community in terms of wildlife, because now you have plants in place that they've probably gone through, they've tested, they've gotten used to, and are either, interested in eating those things or not. So in this space, I wanted to come over here because this was what I was talking about initially with planting radishes near mounds of plants like cucumbers, squash, melons that have issues with the vine borers or with other, sort of beetles and whatnot. And so this is my example of that. I basically came in, I think I did like every 4 feet. I plant my melons and squash and pumpkins a little close together. This is just pumpkins. Melons were in that first row actually, but we did not see them. But yeah, so I do about every 4 feet, and I specifically looked for a spot where I could kind of carve in about a 8-inch to 12-inch mound, like space for a mound to build up there, carved into my cover crops next to some radishes or other brassicas. Instead of pulling them out, like really trying to work the planting space in between them, because they're already established, they're going to continue to sort of protect this as it grows. And I can always cut them back when I need to, right? So it makes sense to do things this way. If you're working with cover crops and if you don't want to go through the process of, tilling or terminating, or even if you do, but maybe you're having major pest issues, this might be a way to go about solving that without having to, add a bunch of like sprays and potions and everything else to make your garden work effectively. So yeah, there are a few more insects than I'm used to, but I found that for every pest insect, there's a predator that's showing up. And so it's really about trying to get that natural balance back in your space so that the pests are more of an inconvenience and less of a real issue. So here's this little planting hole. You can barely see it on camera, but if I pull these guys back just a little, there's a gopher basket in there that I planted a couple of squash seeds in, mounded it up a little just so that the root zone and that soil can warm faster because squash don't like soggy roots, and also they like a lot warmer soil, so we're going to try and accommodate that. You could go higher on the mounds. I was trying to do it, and I have a few behind me here too that are higher. I was trying to get it done while it was raining the other day, so you do what you can, right? But I got those guys in, sort of a modified Three Sisters garden. There's corn in here. You can see some taller ones in the back, and then I've been kind of interplanting with more corn as some don't come up. So really it's just you keep on planting until things grow, and that's how I actually end up having a garden, is just filling in the gaps with more seeds, with more plants, with more love. Like that's the way these things work, right? And then figuring out, what cover crops do we want to cut back or take out when. Now eventually everything will go to seed and die, so you do have to sort of start weighing the pros and cons towards the end of their life cycle. As it gets hot with the winter cover crops, I will probably come through and just like cut a lot of them. I'll let a lot of the brassicas go to seed because I love the flowers. I like having more seeds from them. The roots typically are better rotting in place to help break up some compaction, to help feed some microbes. They often work as a biofumigant underground for a variety of nematodes and other soil-borne pathogens. So with brassicas, I do tend to kind of leave them for as long as I can. With beans and peas and other leguminous plants, I do tend to chop and drop them, whether it's in the rows or in the pathways, right at sort of that pre-flower stage. And maybe a few I'll let go to flower because, you know, who doesn't want to eat some peas or beans? But for the most part, the leguminous plants get chopped and dropped. The grasses get chopped and dropped. I have a lot of like oats and rye and stuff that if I'm planting corn, I won't plant it right into oats and rye and stuff. Or I might plant it into that spot, but I'm either going to cut those way down to the ground, any other grass crops, or I'm going to pull them out and replace them with corn. And I found that to actually be really successful because, again, you're looking at this is a grass and this is a grass, and they share a lot of common soil microorganisms, right? Because they're both in sort of the same family. So even though they're different species, like they're in the same family. So yeah, working with those same microorganisms to help support the crops you're trying to grow because you already have those organisms in place from your cover crops. So I will just go on and on about this all day. But when you start mentally pairing up, you know, okay, I was growing this in this spot. And as long as you haven't seen, I mean, that's the big if, right, in this, is that as long as you haven't seen any major disease issues, pathogen or pest issues that are specific to that crop, that family of crops, then you're usually good to go. It's not going to be like, oh, it's used all of this nutrients out of the soil for this one plant, so it's not going to be available for the other. No, not as long as you terminate your cover crops early enough. But yeah, you don't want to not have a diversity and then make those decisions. As long as you've had a diversity, then you can start swapping in for, you know, your main crops. So this is probably getting really long. I could talk about this all day and we'll probably dig into it a lot more, but I think that sort of covers like the initial basics of, you know, trying to wrap your head around what you're going to do if you're doing cover crops like I am moving forward. One of the things before I wrap this up that I also want to cover is that I will also a lot of times go in between these winter cover crops and start sowing my summer ones. So it could be pushing more beans in that are covers. It could be pushing different grasses and grains in their covers. It really depends on, you know, what does the diversity look like and what goals I'm trying to accomplish. I'm going to put a few links in the description here for the tools that I use to figure out what cover crops to plant because I think that's super important. There's some really great ones out there, so please like just play with them because they're really, really helpful in terms of determining, you know, what sort of things you need to plant to achieve the goals that you're looking to achieve in your gardens or yards or fields or whatever. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. If you like what you see, hit that subscribe button, ding that bell, and follow me on Instagram at FlavorKit because we are nonstop talking about cover crops there, but also lots of other things. So yeah, FlavorKit at Instagram. And until next time, happy gardening.